So I am going to talk about more than Japanese firms, but also this theme of staying power. What does it take to be a competitive company or nation over long periods of time? So I'll give you a little background on this. So as Stuart mentioned, I landed in Japan in 1976, 21 years old, as a Princeton and Asia teaching fellow. I had studied European history, particularly intellectual history, history of science and technology, modernization, the Enlightenment in Europe. And I became interested, once I was in Japan, in Japanese development. And this was, again, 1976. So Japan was still taking off. And China was quite a low developing country at that point. So the attention was really all on Japan. And so I started noticing some things and started studying Japan. That certainly the US and Europe had been at one time the center of best practices in management and organization, industrial policy as well. Japan was known for cheap goods. Made in Japan had a stigma attached to it when I was growing up in the 1950s and 1960s. And then we saw Japan take off, right? There was the rapid growth period, roughly mid-50s through mid-60s, but really very continuous, rapid, solid growth all the way through the 1980s, actually, with some slowing down. And Japan really became the center of best practices in a whole range of areas. And I like to remember that when I ended up going to graduate school in Japanese studies and then ended up in a business school in operations management and technology management and strategy. But being a Japan specialist was an important asset in the late 1980s. I went on the job market in 1984, actually. And about 1/3 of the business school curriculum at Harvard or MIT, I spent time at both places, was based on Japanese firms. Guys, the younger folks don't remember that, but at one time we talked about Japan. So something happened after 1990 where Japanese strengths turned into weaknesses, and this went beyond just what was happening in companies to what was happening in the government, social policies, bunch of things that became quite complicated to understand. Even the great companies, even like Toyota, which I spent half of my doctoral thesis writing about Toyota, had trouble. So I found myself in the last half dozen years or so thinking very much about this notion of sustainability, not in terms of economic environment, but just in terms of business models and competitiveness, which relates to other things. So that's kind of where the theme of staying power comes from. Now there's a little bit more background here. So this is the intellectual tour through my book publications that Stuart saw me present back in 2009. What I was giving there actually was a dress rehearsal for the talk I gave at Oxford, was supposed to give at Oxford just a month or two later. And I'll talk about that in a moment. But 1985, I published The Japanese Automobile Industry, a comparison of Nissan and Toyota, really a history of where did the innovations in manufacturing and quality control and supplier management come from historically. And I ended up focusing a lot on Toyota. And that was building in this comparison of, okay, the West had developed and now Japan had overtaken the West, and how did that happen? That was kind of built into that book. And that was my doctoral thesis at Harvard and my first book. And then while I was writing my doctoral thesis and some exposure in college, I became interested in software as well. I had to write my thesis on a mainframe computer. I took some computer science workshops and courses and figured the next great challenge for Japan was, could they write software? And I started studying what they were doing in terms of attempting to apply some large-scale engineering and quality practices to software. So I wrote a book called Japanese Software Factories, which got me involved in the software industry in the United States, as well as in India, by the way. Some Indian entrepreneurs were very interested in this. I ended up helping a company get founded and ended up on the board of an Indian company. The last 10 years, I probably spent more time in India, actually, with software people than anywhere else. But it really goes back to my early work on Japanese software factories. I then wrote a book on Microsoft Secrets, which is which was really an attempt to understand where the money was in software. I noticed the Japanese were very good at process, but they didn't know how to build products, didn't know how to make money from software. It was really a complement to selling hardware. But there was a company called Microsoft that had actually figured out how to kind of print money, Windows licenses like printing money. So I got access to Microsoft because they were interested in my work on Japanese software quality. Then I looked at the internet, more work on lean production, product development, strategy. And a lot of this work led to another book in 2002, which has been a center of a lot of work I've done in recent years on platforms. That a lot of these industries like software are different from conventional industries because they revolve around this concept of a platform, which I'll talk about in a moment. Business of Software 2004 was based on a course I started at MIT in 1997, really about software and then internet entrepreneurship. And then the 2010 book, Staying Power, which I'll talk a little bit about today at Professor Pickens' request. And where that goes back to is the 2009 Oxford Lectures, the Clarendon Lectures. So that's what I was doing in England at the time. That Oxford has this fellowship which every year they give to an international scholar and ask that person to come and deliver a series of lectures and then write a book based on their research. There's been a lot of eminent people doing it, and I was very happy to be asked to do this. They give you several years, 4 years advance warning. So I got my letter in 2005 saying you're going to come in 2009, deliver these lectures, and the following year you need to have a book. So they asked me to synthesize what I had learned over all these different studies, from automobiles to software, consumer electronics, et cetera. So I spent about 3 years thinking about how do I tie all this together. And of course I had worked on this problem of what are best practices in different areas, in manufacturing and software engineering and strategy. And across several different industries. Mostly historical studies, but I had learned from MIT how to do some larger scale statistical studies, larger samples. So I kind of mixed some things up. But in any case, I ended up focusing on this theme of what are some of the underlying principles that really seem to stand the test of time and help explain why some firms can be successful, survive, and thrive over 100 years, say. And I kept thinking of some Japanese firms, but other firms like IBM, which recently celebrated its 100th anniversary. So I did have to deliver the book. I'm not sure why I have fall 2010. The book came out in actually spring 2010, maybe a little bit early. I also found that as I was doing this, I wanted to understand what the literature was on best practice. And there's a lot of academic literature, which I did go through, but there's a lot of popular literature too. And I remember going back to a very dusty reading room at Balliol College at Oxford to pick out a copy of In Search of Excellence, which I had at home but couldn't find. And that was one of the first books that where I had been exposed to this concept of best practice. Anyone here ever read that book? No? A couple of you. Anyone ever hear of it? Well, okay. It's a wonderful book, but I also learned a lot about research from studying some of these books. So this was a couple consultants at McKinsey. They had, the firm had 62 clients at the time. They chose the best 43, and they interviewed people. They thought about it. They looked at secondary literature, and they tried to identify the factors that had explained how these 43 companies got to be so good, and they focused on a smaller number of them. And they talked about action bias, close to the customer, entrepreneurship, people focus, hands-on, focused firm, lean, tight centralized values, this kind of thing, with decentralization. It ended up that these were very good qualities, but they were actually describing firms that had kind of survived this shakeout process of their analysis. It didn't really tell us much about how these firms got to where they were. The academics call that sort of a survivor bias in the analysis. So still, the other problem with this study was that they had highlighted a small number of firms and as excellent firms, and fairly quickly a whole bunch of them went bankrupt. And many of them don't even exist anymore. Atari, Atari's kind of still around, but Data General, Digital Equipment, IBM, shortly after this book came out, posted the largest loss in corporate history. NCR disappeared for a while, came back. Wang disappeared. Xerox practically went bankrupt. So it seemed like for a while the best way to have trouble as a company was to get on someone's list of excellent companies. And if you think about it, you can understand why that is, right? Because you suddenly become a target, people copy you, anything you're good at, they will copy, and then if you don't move forward, you're going to find yourself in decline. By the way, I am going to get back to the Japan story, but think about that proposition in the context of Japanese firms, and you can get some understanding of what happened to Japan. Another interesting book, Good to Great, Jim Collins, same kind of things, even more complex in his analysis, looked at 1,500 companies, ended up focusing on 11 that had the best stock market performance. Another classic case of survivor bias and even randomness, 11 out of 1,500 firms. Nonetheless, these were, this was a unique sample, and too unique in many ways. And he talked about things like internally promoted CEOs and focus on talent and what you're good at and discipline culture, these kinds of things. Again, hard to disagree with these qualities, but no real analysis of did these kinds of factors create the kind of performance that they analyzed. And particularly stock performance is subject to a lot of random factors. So again, it was hard to make sense of this, and also because his small list of his 11 firms, a large number of them also went bankrupt afterwards, right? Abbott Labs, Circuit City doesn't exist anymore, Fannie Mae, which was in the middle of this massive financial crisis we had, Gillette, which was taken over, Walgreens, which has been up and down, is still around. But again, I felt kind of dissatisfied with this popular best practice research. So again, just stepping back from this, there's a lot of these kinds of studies. There's many, many more that I haven't talked about. And academics sometimes get into this too, but we're trained in a different way. We're trained to control our sample more carefully, not always carefully enough, but generally more carefully. But a lot of the journalists relied on these very small case studies and small samples and really didn't have a lot of context to what they were talking about. Yeah, a pharmaceutical company may be doing great at some period in time, but their patents might run out and then they practically go bankrupt. I mean, you need to control for those kinds of things, which most of these guys don't. So there's really these issues of specification and context. The other one problem is imitation. So, if you're doing something good, but everybody copies it, so that was best practice, now it's common practice, and it doesn't differentiate you as a firm. So how often does that happen? When we look at best practices and lists of firms, we're taking a snapshot in time, right? Not really looking longitudinally at what's happening. So often we get misled by when we took that snapshot, right? If you took a snapshot in 1998, you would have concluded that any company with .com after its name had a genius as the CEO, right? If you took that same snapshot 3 years later, you would have concluded any company with a .com after its name probably had a fool as its CEO, right? And bigger fools as investors, right? So, this notion of we have to understand the time and the context. And again, I'm going to relate this back to Japan. We understood Japan during this miracle period and pulled out a lot of practices as being standards for the world, but we weren't fully understanding the competitive context and the historical context. I'll get back to that. So the life cycle stage, type of technology, industry structure, institutional environment, And this whole notion of luck and population ecology, a lot of times, again, we're looking at companies at a particular time. We're not accounting for survivor bias or trying to understand factors that drove performance rather than kind of describing the characteristics of performance. And you know, what is determined by strategy versus what is determined by chance. I actually teach an advanced strategy on this, and I perform an exercise, and I could do it here if we had time, but I make everybody stand up, and I get a coin out, and I ask them to choose heads or tails, right? And then as I flip the coin. With the first flip of the coin, about half of you will sit down, right? And if I flip the coin, and we do that exercise for a room of this size, about 5 or 6 times, there will be, after 5 or 6 rounds, 1 or 2 people still standing. They will have chosen correctly in each one of those rounds. And I go through this in my class. Actually, I give a class of 80 students or so. It takes about 6, 7 rounds to get to that. And I'll ask that person, so what did you do when you made your choices? And some of the students will sometimes say, well, actually, I kind of decided I would choose heads for 2 times, and then I would go to tails, and then I would alternate it. They actually had a strategy. And the strategy turned out to be right in that case. And I said, well, you know, you might be Warren Buffett, or Bill Gates, or maybe we can write a book about your strategy for choosing the right coin toss. Okay. Well, if you think about 10,000 firms competing, you're going to have some that compete well over long periods of time through pure chance, or having made the right decisions at the right time, but not necessarily based on talent or other factors. But it does happen. It certainly happens in the stock market. So actually, those kinds of things happen more in industries that are very much affected by chance. Sometimes it happens in the pharmaceutical industry, right? You happen to hit on that hit drug. Sometimes it happens in the video game industry, but some other times it's, you know, companies that do well over long periods of time are driven by deeper talents or capabilities or ability to adjust or something. And those are the factors I wanted to get at, to sort of pull away what is chance and just sort of population ecology, just looking at the survivors. So actually, going on, we tried to do an exercise on this looking at Japan, and I was part of the group with some of my former PhD students who were Japanese professors, the Aichi Aoshima and Akira Takeishi, who were at Hitotsubashi at that time. And so for 5 years, we met every year on Waikiki Beach in Hawaii, actually at the Duotani in Waikiki, courtesy of, I guess it was, Momusho or somebody in Japan paid for all this. And we met, and so we spent 4 or 5 years meeting every year, trying to understand, well, so what was enduring in Japan, and what was temporary, what was driven by context. And we ended up writing this book, Made in Japan, and part of this, actually, I did incorporate into my staying power book. So I want to talk about some of the framework of this. But we found from this exercise, and we were all professors of management, that Japan's problems were far more complicated than we could address as management professors. That the companies were still pretty good as companies, but they were subject to some factors that I had mentioned. I'll go back to again. But the complexity of Japan stretched across government policy, social policy, educational system, politics. You know, more concrete poured in Japan in 1 year than the entire United States, for example. You know, why is that? And it's largely pork barrel local politics, you know, driving construction projects that don't create any assets that the country can utilize later on. I mean, all these kinds of things were kind of sapping wealth and assets and intellectual energy in Japan. And it really wasn't a management problem or a problem that we could say you can solve with a more clever strategy, for example. So we got into a lot of these issues, and I created a bit of a chart, which is in the appendix of Staying Power, but it's also in the appendix of the Made in Japan book. So for example, in the 80s, the financial system in Japan was a source of strength. Low interest rates, lots of capital to invest, banks that were protected from ups and downs of the world markets, a lot of deficit financing. But as the pie in Japan stopped growing and stagnated or started to shrink, these kind of flipped around and became weaknesses. Low interest rates also means a kind of an inefficient use of capital. People are not paying you a lot of money for the money that you give them. Poor investment returns, banks that are essentially bankrupt. They've lent out more money than their assets and collateral are worth. And a government that essentially survives, it's not really bankrupt because governments can print money, but that have these massive and growing deficits. The political system, stable, conservative, but again, a weakness side of that is it struggles over a shrinking pie. Consensus-oriented is kind of a strength when you have a growing market and lots of decisions to make and people have some agreement as to what to do, but when the pie is shrinking and people are fighting over assets that are shrinking, you have political gridlock. And so you don't have any significant change. Sharing of wealth through lots of subsidies. I once did this calculation using some numbers from Brookings Institution. That's something like half of the Japanese population was subsidized in one form or another. Small and medium-sized businesses, the service sector, construction sector, old people. If you tally up the numbers, it was a huge amount. And this is largely also an artifact of the age in Japan. But only a wealthy country can really afford to subsidize half the population. And Japan can do it because it is wealthy. Fortunately, it got wealthy before it got old, right, as they say. But still, it doesn't leave much left over to invest or invest in the future, and that's been part of Japan's problem. So you have slow negative growth or unemployment. The social cultural system, right, standardized primary education, it's a great thing, but they've never invested enough in universities in Japan. And if you look at where does the source of a lot of the energy you see in the United States come from, or new industries, right? Manufacturing declines, but we create new industries in software, telecom, biotech, new materials. They really come out of university research and close ties between universities, companies, venture capital. You don't have that nexus in Japan. Well, they're starting to build it, they've been trying to build it, but it's really not there. Hierarchy, group, individual, culture, but maybe that's good when there is an agreement as to what to do, like rebuild Japan after World War II, but when you need more creative individuals, more freedom for entrepreneurship, for example, you don't get very far. And the list goes on. The economic system, low wages, high savings, high exports, really good. Again, in good times, but in bad times, it means the yen is too expensive. There's bubbles in stocks and real estate. People don't know what to do with the money that they have. And you have not enough consumer spending. So it creates conditions like deflation, right? And then finally, we get to management. So this was our list, right? We're talking for several years. And we had a long list of problems even before we got to companies, right? And you can go through everything. That was seen as a best practice in Japanese management. Lifetime employment in large firms. That was a very important element to retaining talent and investing in people when the economy was growing. But when those skills became outdated, for example, people didn't understand software programming, for example, you can't get rid of those people, right? So lifetime employment becomes like a rope around the neck of the Japanese. And also the Europeans, by the way. Seniority-based wages, the same thing, doesn't reward merit and achievement. Company-based unions, which leads to a lot of ability to do innovation, actually, in things like process. I spent a lot of time studying Toyota. Toyota could never have introduced the Toyota Production System innovations without a company union that let it experiment with worker practices and the way they laid out machinery and the way they managed suppliers and overtime and things of that sort. But again, in a negative environment, there's a lot of concerns about worker welfare and who is getting the money that is left. So all of these things, long-term view is great, but then there's little pressure for efficiency. Consensus decision-making, which we associate with Japan. Again, very good when it's clear what to do. When it's not clear what to do, you have committees making decisions, and ever try to design anything good with a committee, you end up with the lowest common denominator. So a lot of the strategy decisions or even policy decisions coming out of government in Japan are not very bold or creative. They're lowest common denominator. They're the kinds of decisions that offend the least number of people, for example. Now, we tend to do that in the United States too, but at least we kick out our politicians every 4 years and we get another bunch in saying, you know, change is the way forward. And for a while, it kind of works. But Japan got stuck in a rut. Okay, just in time, you know, limits to that, diminishing returns, Kaizen, diminishing returns, low-cost dedicated suppliers, the Shitaoke system in Japan becomes like a shell game where big companies push off costs and labor to the supply chain beneath them. And they push it to their third-tier suppliers, and then there's nowhere else to push it, right? And that also happened in Japan. So this is a long, complicated discussion. And there's also a dynamic. If you're very successful, you know, you grow larger, you expand more, bigger operations. That leads to more complexity. That's more difficult to manage. By that time, too, if you've been successful, you've already attracted a lot of imitators and rivals. And as you get that complexity and scale, you're less flexible, and it becomes more difficult to change. More inflexibility, decline in quality, attention, agility. And this happens at the firm level. It happens at the institutional level. Universities are subject to this, too. But I think it happens at the nation level, right? Nations are agglomerations of firms at some level, at least from a business point of view. So the issue of can we prevent this? If we're aware of it, what can we do about it? Can we reduce the cycle? But a lot of this, I think, helps explain what happened to Japan. Okay, so there we go. So just quickly on Japan, you know, so I think what we concluded, and again, I write about this in Staying Power, the firms, the best firms are still very good, right? They haven't really gone away. The weak, protected firms and weaker sectors are still weak. They haven't gotten any better. And the big thing, though, is that competitors in the Western countries and Asia have caught up. And as I said, I spent my doctoral thesis, my first book, studying, you know, the secrets of the Toyota production system. We learned those things. It took us a while to learn them in the United States, and we didn't fully learn everything. But for the most part, Toyota practices have transformed manufacturing. And a lot of Japanese engineering practices have transformed the way we think about engineering and quality. And so we've caught up in critical areas. In many ways, have gone beyond what Japan has done. And then Japan had, again, high yen. And even at the macro level, Japan is still very rich. But this political gridlock, again, Moshiwaki and I, makes economic reform very, very difficult. We were so frustrated trying to make recommendations, but it's very hard to get anything done. And then other areas, weak university research, difficult government business university relations, very tough to improve quickly. So these are all the kinds of things that are features of economies that are actually able, or firms that are able to adjust and do well over long periods of time. So a little Toyota case, I was on the Toyota analysis committee, and so they had a lot of problems that were not so obvious. Gradually, too many products, too many options, too many designs. They expanded very rapidly overseas and weren't able to have the same discipline in manufacturing or supplier qualification that they had domestically. So they ended up with some problems in the corrosion, the pedal acceleration. But the bigger question was, why didn't Toyota management recognize these problems earlier? There was actually evidence of severe quality problems happening even in the late 1990s or mid-1990s, which they kind of put under the rug and didn't pay attention to. So I spent some time looking at that. And again, they're still very good, but their advantage did not translate as well outside Japan as it did in Japan, particularly when they expanded quickly. The transplants have done well as factories, but they couldn't quite use the just-in-time system in the same way outside Japan. Relied a lot on suppliers that were not as good as the suppliers in Japan didn't test as well. And they were caught up by competitors in many ways. So again, it's not that Toyota went through a massive decline. They did go through a massive expansion, but the rest of the world caught up while Toyota kind of declined a little bit. And that was enough to really pose a serious threat. Again, they're still there, but they're not as dominant as they once were. So this phenomenon of great or excellent firms declining over time, like great economies, like the US or Japan or Rome going back a couple of thousand years, it's a normal thing if you look through history. When you're at the top of the hill, there's only one place to go, right? You're going to go down. And the trick is actually, if you go down, to figure out how to get back up there again and not just keep going down. But no one stays at the top forever because too many things change. And when we try to understand best practice, we have to understand that our snapshots may be of someone on the top of the hill in a particular time period, but we need really more of a historical view to really understand these deeper principles. So I spent a lot of time thinking about this. A bunch of assumptions that are in my book. One, no competitive advantage or set of competencies are really permanent. All best practices must be understood in context. And if they're really going to be best practices, they need to be evolving. They need to be dynamic. They're not going to be static. Everything is relative to the competition. Everyone experiences ups and downs. Firms, industries, individuals. We have our good days and bad days, right? Countries have good decades and bad decades. And it's because of improved competition, business cycles, declines in attention. Toyota, for example, didn't physically or start doing things differently, but management stopped paying as much attention to process and details as they did in the past. They did get somewhat complacent. They started after 50 years of being successful to take their success for granted. It's hard to blame them, right? But it did happen, which is why having some bad luck or some competition come up is good for you, because it does make you better in the long run. This other conclusion, which is kind of behind a lot of these things, we tend to blame poor performance on bad luck and good performance on skill. Well, neither may be true. And again, we really need to understand this, right? In the internet boom, we all thought we were geniuses, especially at MIT. We were creating these internet startups every week. And then we realized really it wasn't us, right? It was a boom, and we need to separate out what is really enduring. There's other things going here as well. As I was writing this book, I realized that we're are in a different age, and I call it the age of innovation and commoditization. That we have this phenomenon where people want new products, new services, new features, but people don't want to pay much for them. The internet has brought in this era of free, and in many ways, free is destructive, because somebody has to pay for something at some point. And it creates this shakeout environment very quickly. We've seen it in hardware, right? The capability on my iPhone here is bigger than the mainframe computer I wrote my doctoral thesis on by an order of magnitude or two. Tremendous software is free, accessed over the internet. In manufacturing, China's prices have become the world's prices, and services, India's prices have become the world's prices. So there's been this incredible value shift, I argue, from products to services, complex services, and platforms that drive demand, and very little room for error. So here were the principles I came up with. And again, these kind of summarize 30 or 25 years of my own work. And I've got, I think, 11 minutes to finish them. But these are really in the form of advice to managers. But one is that you need to think about platforms, not just products. And platforms are technologies or foundational products that sort of bring multiple people together and create more value around that platform. And a good example is the iPhone, right? So Apple tends to design things and control everything that goes into it. But this is really a platform, because there's a million applications I can access through this. And it was designed in a way to let other people do things with it that the designers never even thought of doing. And that's what makes this device a platform and not just a product. One of my favorite applications is this little thing here. Right? So when they designed this is a flashlight, but it was designed in a modular way where there was access to the flash for the camera that was built in it. And someone wrote a little application, you know, send a little message to the flash, go on and stay on. And then you have a flashlight. And there's like a million other things you could do with these devices. And Apple is not as open as some other platforms like Google Android or Windows before that. But that's an important part of competition today in a lot of industries. And a lot of these are connected by software and networks, these platforms of innovation. And just to make it quick, this is a whole area that Japan kind of missed. Japan is very good at building boxes and components, not good in thinking in terms of these platforms. And so the whole world has kind of moved beyond Japan, and Sony is still stuck making boxes like the Walkman that doesn't connect with anything, right? That's a big part of what happened to Japan. We don't really have time to talk about it. Services. Most advanced countries have about 80% of their GMP coming from services, not products. Another problem that Japan faced, just making boxes. But it's really tailoring boxes, connecting boxes, providing different kinds of customization or maintenance or tailored versions of systems, you know, things that, or on the internet, services like Facebook is a service, Google is an internet search service. They list themselves as an internet services company. These are all automated services that take advantage of different platforms. And we don't see Japan's presence there very much, for example. They're kind of behind there. Capabilities is another one of the things that I argue about, that in the long run we're defined by the excellence of our capabilities, our human resources, our knowledge. And a lot of this comes out of universities. And one of my highlights before was Japan has underinvested in universities historically, or in at least research and connections with practice. Pull, don't push is about creating real-time connections with the market. It's sort of invented by Toyota with the Toyota production system. Actually, that came from American supermarkets. But Japan is still not very good at pulling information from customers and reacting very quickly to this or anticipating customer needs. American companies are much better at that. I also talk about this idea of scope, not scale, that modern companies are really not about just pushing out products in massive numbers of them. It's about providing differentiation, different versions of your products, different kinds of services. And the economic logic behind that is economies of scope. And that's reusing knowledge and frameworks and technologies across multiple products, multiple customers. And Japan actually does some of that reasonably well, but perhaps not as well as they should for different kinds of products. And the last one, I think, is a big problem, flexibility, not just efficiency. That, you know, we train our students in business schools how to be more efficient, maximize profits, get economies of scale. But that builds in a lot of inflexibility. And so another issue of staying power over time is who can adapt to change, right? So I studied Japanese software factories, as you remember in my second book. Japanese were excellent at building mainframe software. They optimized organizations and process and people to do that. And then suddenly the personal computer appears, right? They could not adapt. If you look at American computer companies at that time, most of our employees were trained in computer science or electrical engineering. You go to Japan, who was in the software factories? They were largely high school graduates, maybe with a technical orientation or background, but they were trained to do one thing and do one thing well, couldn't adapt. The Indians did much better, actually, with the software factory concepts, and they've come back to us in many ways, but because they had much better university education. They actually filled their software factories with students with backgrounds in computer science or mathematics or something of that sort. So again, flexibility is a complex notion, but it's also a big part of staying power. So I finally offered in my book here a little bit of a framework that one of the problems that Japan had was that the world had changed. and Japanese firms individually, the country more broadly, had not really responded well. But there used to be a simpler way of competing where the focus was on standalone products. If you made a really great product, you just needed a strategy behind that, and you could have an organization that was kind of push and scale or focused and efficiency focused, and that was enough to compete. And it still is enough to compete in some component industries or some standalone product industries. But if we look in many industries today, they're really defined by much more complex platforms and services and connected in very unique ways. Competition is defined by a deeper set of capabilities, not just being good at repetitive manufacturing, for example. And it requires a set of other qualities that require, not just coming up with plans and pushing products out to market, but being able to iterate very, very quickly, in which I call sort of a pull rather than push mode of operation, and scope, not just scale and flexibility. And these are really characteristics that define who does well and who doesn't over long periods of time. So I don't know how much more time we want to get to this. I'm going to skip some of this stuff because I don't have time for it. But this is just a little bit of a tutorial on what is a platform versus a product. But it's a notion that there's a lot of other players. You can't just put out a product and be successful. And other parts of the market pull in your users. And it's not a standalone way of competition anymore. And Facebook is just one example, but whether you're talking about mobile phones or telecom services, these are really platform industries. And there's many others around. And we see Japanese firms competing with components, but not really dominating the design of platforms and the architecture of whole industries. And that's been, I think, one of the major weaknesses in Japan. So do we want to leave some time for Q&A or not? Yes or I don't? You didn't really direct that. Okay, so I have a few more minutes, so let me try to wrap this up. So my discussion of platforms is really about, as a firm, how do you get beyond just sort of making products that are kind of one-hit wonders, which we've had a lot of. We've had a lot of from Japan in consumer electronics, for example. Platforms really, once they're established, like Microsoft Windows or Google Search or Google Android, even some Apple technologies, although Apple is more of a product company like Sony rather than an industry platform company. Platforms stay a long time, and they generate global ecosystems of partners and innovation around them. Services really is about getting beyond commodity manufacturing because, again, almost anybody can copy even the physical design. If you walk down the street in China, you will see 10 different phones that look exactly like this, right? And you'll find some, like from Samsung, that kind of even go a step beyond the Apple iPhone. And now Apple is copying Samsung, right? And so Apple's another case of too much focus on the product, not enough on the platform. But there is a good and healthy focus on services in Apple, like iTunes, iCloud, Apple Pay, for example. And these are the kinds of innovations that probably in the long run have more value than the hardware, which becomes commoditized. And then capabilities, pull, scope, flexibility. It's really about figuring out how to control your future rather than just be a victim of the future. So I never, when I did my book, I never thought about it as a framework for analyzing countries, but I found myself thinking through my 6 enduring principles and applying them to different countries. And you can cut this 2 ways. I can profile the US or profile platforms. But if we think about who's good at platforms, it really is American companies. And we see some in China as well. But that's because China has built this great wall around the country, and they have their own internal platforms, whether it's Tencent or Alibaba or WeChat, for example, more specifically. They're not really global yet, but they're trying, but the market is big enough. But Japan has really struggled there. There's a couple of things, and there's some domestic, but Japanese tend to think products, not platforms. And Europe has struggled there as well a bit. Services, again, U.S. are very good, very strong there. We apply a lot of science to services. India is very good in services too, a lot of talent. Japan is okay, but not so great. China is very weak there. They're really still a manufacturing country when all advanced economies move towards services of different types, financial services, IT services, et cetera. So China has a real challenge there in the future. If I look at capabilities, again, US, Europe are very strong, and I think this comes from education and universities especially. Japan is kind of weak there, but not as weak as maybe some other places in third world. And we can just go on. Flexibility, go down to flexibility. Again, U.S. is very strong, and part of this is our labor rules, our government. We can fire 100,000 people in a company if we really want to. We can do it. We let companies go bankrupt. Japan has a tough time doing that. Europe has a tough time doing that. China has a tough time doing that too. But if, again, you look down the list, and again, this is a biased list from me, but I'm not exactly an uninformed observer. But it helps, at least for me, to explain why Japan has had some problems moving forward. And it kind of presents a blueprint. And I didn't actually think about this, but I found we had some translations of the book, and I've gone around talking about it. In Japanese, it's actually called Kunrin Suru Kigyo no Mutsu no Hosoku, rather than staying power. The 6 principles for creating like a dominant company. But we found in China, for example, the Chinese are very concerned about these kinds of principles, and they're worried about, will they follow the path of Japan? In 10 years, 20 years from now, will they be considered an economic basket case? And Koreans, too, very concerned about this. So, again, I've enjoyed giving you at least a whirlwind tour of some of my ideas, and hopefully these have given you something more to think about. And by the way, I'll plug my next book, which is coming out in the spring. Here we focus on a few ideas, but trying to understand, again, what was behind Microsoft, Intel, and Apple, both the ups and downs, through the lens of the 3 CEOs, Bill Gates, Andy Grove, and Steve Jobs, the 3 founders or transformational CEOs. So that comes out in the spring, and maybe there'll be a chance to talk about that at one of these forums sometime. Okay? All right, thank you very much.